Hello everybody, once again I'm Liam Crafton Jr., aka Zorval Chan Less Than Guru. We have Mars Video Cat here, and today is part one of a multi-part, I say multi-part because I'm not sure how many parts this is going to be, but a multi-part video conglomeration, walkthrough, whatever you want to call it, of my Palladium rewrite. So, I've stated before, and if you look on this playlist about my campaign of the Palladium Nintir Veil, then you will see one that says I'm rewriting Palladium, and I list all the reasons why I'm doing that, and that was the reason why I did this. Mainly, it was due to clarifications, ambiguities, and making this fit my world and my group, and not having it based off of the Palladium world as its own kind of inherent world to it. So I started off with the Palladium book, as well as a few things from other books, such as certain OCCs, occupational character classes, and skills, etc. So I had here's the main book, here's the stuff we're allowing from other books, and here's my supplement. And basically, what was happening is people were getting confused. They were looking in the book, reading the rule, and not reading a supplement, or what happens when the rule says this, or the supplement says this, and this other book says this. So I decided I wanted to just bring everything into one PDF that I could give to all my players and have this be the rules. So it has taken me a year, but I finally got through everything that a player needs to know. There are certain things that I am adding because I'm finding the direction of the game has kind of slightly veered off, and there's rules such as and people are wanting to build organizations and buildings and taverns and adventure guilds and stuff like that, and that stuff really isn't in Palladium, but it is in, say, a BECMI, the rules cyclopedia of D&D, and I'm looking at those rules and adapting them because I do want to have that old school type mentality and feel. So I want those things to be allowed. I'm just figuring out how to do it for Palladium. So this part one, will be mainly the species that I'm allowing, why I've made certain rules the way that I've done things, how they've changed from Palladium, what I added, what I took away, as well as attributes. So I want to do that in this video, and then the next video we'll get into the occupations. So I'm not saying that this is the best thing ever. I'm saying that this works really well with me and my mentality of a 48-year-old player game master with official in a different game design and authorship, I guess, develop, design, author within Torg Eternity, wanting to do an old school feel, wanting Palladium First Edition, but seeing a lot of things that didn't quite meet my needs and my table's needs. So, as always, what is best for you and your table may be very different. You may not agree with any of this, but maybe it does bring up some ideas, some thoughts, and then you can tailor your own rules of Palladium First Edition or any game. This might be something that you are doing some BX or BECMI or AD&D First or Second Edition, and you're like, hey, that's kind of cool. Maybe I can take that and put it into my own game. So hopefully something is valuable in this series of videos to you, if nothing else, just to get you to look on how you might make your own house rules for a game that you want to play, but there's some little things in there that you don't necessarily like. So, this I call Zordaria Palladium. Zordaria is the name of my world. It is the name of my general fantasy world that has done all the fantasy games that have that I've game mastered have taken place on this world. So it's one long timeline with a history, and when people come in, if they are really into it, they can link events together. They know who the major deities are, who the major world shakers throughout history are, even if it is their previous characters. But some of my players just want to play their character now, and they don't care about history or anything like that, and it's not a needed thing, but it is there, kind of like Easter eggs and stuff, such for the players that like that type of thing. So Zordaria is the name, as you know. Zorwalchan, less than Guru. Zor is a nickname I've had for 40, not 40, 35 years. And one of my friends in one of my early games was like, hey, let's just call your world Zordaria. And it stuck. I liked it and it stuck. So Zordaria is the name of the world. Palladium is the base core of the system. So Zordaria Palladium is what I call this rewrite of the Palladium system. And I mentioned in my tools I use for my online games, I use DAZ Studio for art, and all of the art in this is using DAZ Studio and assets from there. But once I render them in a 2D form, then they are my copyrights, so I don't have to worry about somebody saying, "Oh, you can't do that because I own the copyright." That type of thing. That's why I use it. So this is the beginning of the rules, and look over here because my new video thing is here, so I can see both my face and that. It works different than my other one. My other one just overlapped everything together. This one is a little different. If I look over here, I'm looking at my second monitor to scroll through the pages. So here's all of my base species, and I will call them races because I will slip, but I was trying to get off of the name races. Races have a real world earthly connotation that has gotten very bad, I think. This is my opinion. When people start saying, oh, this race in this fantasy game represents this race, and I don't even think of humans being in different races. They have different ethnic backgrounds, but when you say this fantasy race is equivalent to this human, real world Earth ethnic background or peoples, I don't like that. It's completely something I want to get away from. It is something I think is very bad. It makes it so that if you have something like evil orcs, all of a sudden you are a bad person because orcs obviously are associated with this. And I think that is the wrong thing. So after thinking about it a while, I decided to call them species. They're humans. Humans is a species. They cannot interbreed with, or I do go along with Palladium's biology factor that humans and elves are completely, they might look similar, but they're completely separate biological. Basically, like if you have a cat and a dog, to somebody who's never seen a cat and a dog, they might look similar, but they cannot interbreed. So it's something like that. I just wanted to basically say the reasoning why it says species up here, why that's the term that I try to use, but since every game out there pretty much every fantasy game out there calls them races, and it's just so ingrained of decades into this head. If I say races, it's a slip, but I really want to call them species. So I have a very definitive, these are the creating a player character steps. Palladium within the community is well known arguments to occur that you cannot make a Palladium character using the Palladium rules if you go in order. And the reason is they say choose roll your stats and then choose your race, but your race determines what d6s you roll for your stats. And some people say, well, you can still do it. Everybody knows what to do. Yeah, everybody knows, but if you would go straight step by step, you would not be able. If you were put this into a computer program, the computer would break because Step 1 cannot be done until you do step 2. And you can't get to step 2 without doing step 1, so you're immediately broke. Humans, we can understand that, so most people ignore it, realize what's going on, change things, etc. But the very first thing you need to do is you need to choose your species. You need to choose your species because that is going to give you how many d6s you roll for your attributes, and the attribute will give you what occupations you will be allowed to choose as your starting occupation. So choose your species, you determine your attributes, you determine your hit points and your shock points, which is something that I put in. It wasn't part of my original supplement. It was something that I thought about later, that I'm using, and so far I'm liking. And when we get to that, I'll explain why I did that and why I don't just call it SDC like every other Palladium game. Then choose alignment and motive. I add motive. I think motive, and I've had this in another video, why I think motive is important to go along with alignment, unless you have some mystical world where everybody is bound by their alignment, which is a perfectly fine type of world if you want to do that. This is not that, and I like the idea of motive. Choose your occupation. Character classes in D&D, occupational character classes in most Palladium. They also have racial character classes and psychic character classes. I just call them in Palladium First Edition occupations. Just makes it simple. I will in I will at times just call them character classes as well, but in my in my table officially, being an unofficial product, they are occupations. Selecting your elective and secondary skills, and then finishing it with whatever spells and abilities, etc., that you have. So if you look at the picture down here, hopefully you'll be able to see my cursor. If not, look towards the bottom of the page. Um, there are a lot of species, and the majority of them are ones that would be in some way or form available to a Palladium First Edition original or Palladium Second. But there's a lot that I added, and I went through a lot of thought before adding them, and I was kind of pro and against. There were some pros and cons, and I really had to decide what it was, and I decided to add the extra species. And so I will kind of explain that a little in my thinking, my thought, etc. When I first started doing the Palladium as a choice, when that was the number one or number two for everybody, when I gave them four choices of old school type games made from 70s, early 80s, what game do we wish to play? They chose Palladium, first or second choice on everybody's list. And when I was going through it, there's two books that you mainly can get species from. The main book, which has 13 playable species, as well as the back of the book, they give options for even like playing fairies and stuff like that. And then there is the monster and animals supplement book that has lots of different species in there, like the bear people. What I got in my campaign, what the player Jenny was playing Bodil, the bear woman. And so at the beginning, I said, these are all you can play, these 13 species from the first book, and I'm not going anywhere else. But then I remembered Jenny had for a long time, ever since our very first she played Palladium under me back in the 1990s, had always wanted to be a bear person. And so I was, okay, we will we will let you be a bear person. And then since this Zordaria, the Nintir Vale, is happening within a month from a previous campaign that was a D&D 4th edition that had things like shard mines and minotaurs and devas and tieflings, etc. I then was, do I have these as playable characters? And this is after everybody's already made the character. We've already been going, and but I decided to do the rewrite. And it's like, if somebody dies, do I want to allow these different types of species into my game? And at first, I just kind of wanted to stick with the Palladium, the Palladium like 13 that they have. But the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, I want to have that thing where Jenny wanted to be the bear woman. Let her be the bear woman. What if somebody else wants to be this type of species? Let's go ahead and allow that. So then I really started breaking down things of what was in my world previously, what people might like now, and what is in Palladium. So, very first thing is we have the thing I talked about earlier, the race versus species. I wanted species. I want them to be biologically different. And one thing in Palladium is they had ogres, and ogres were this strange middle ground between a troll and a human. And the ogres could actually interbreed with humans, and that was a problem I did not want, or a thing that I basically did not want. Um, Ogres were pretty much just a lesser troll in all ways, and I didn't really see them needed as a player character. I do have them as NPCs, um, but I basically decided to cut them. So if I'm cutting them, I'm going to bring something as a somewhat replacement, I guess. So it's not to say Amazons are ogres. It's to say I needed a replacement, or I wanted a replacement. And in the past, I have had Amazon civilizations. In the mythology of the world, basically they have this mystical potion that they know how to make, and they give it to girl children who, before puberty, they take this, and then it basically makes them strong and muscular and athletic, etc. And it will kill boys. It will kill male children. So they don't basically, they're humans. They have a thing, but it's not quite the species of ogres and humans. They are actual humans that have just been mystically modified into their own society using a potion. So you may say that I'm stupid for it, but I wanted to give the reasons why I'm doing things. So we have the Amazons here, and I didn't want a whole list of background information, etc. I basically wanted to list what they were, give you a height and weight range for somebody to kind of look through, give you how many d6s you rolled for your attributes, give the size die. Basically, it's a concept that I came up with Dunamis back in the early 2000s, and I really liked it then, and it's really worked well in Palladium. Basically, it is your weapons. Instead of trying to say these are gnome-sized weapons and these are normal weapons, and gnome-sized weapons have, if you look in the Palladium chart, they have a huge, or not a huge, but they have like a gnome-sized this does this, a gnome-sized this does this d6, or this d4, etc. And then for large weapons, they say add a d6, which is really good. If you have 1d6, it doubles it. But if you have something that's a 3d6, it only adds 1d6. Didn't quite make a lot of sense to me. And then when you come up with things like flat out, dwarves can't be longbowmen because longbows are too big. But then you're like, but what if they make a dwarf size longbow? That doesn't make sense to me. You just make a dwarf size polearm, you make a dwarf size whatever. So with the size die, very small is a D3. Um, Small is a D4. Medium is a D6. Large is a D8. Very large is a D10. And that is the player species. And then if you go to tiny, it might be a D2, which would be something, some creature, monster, animal, etc. out there that's tiny, smaller than very small. And then on the other side, you get to, like, say, giant, huge, ginormous, whatever. and those go up D12, D20, etc. But it's a way that I found has really, really worked well in just saying, hey, a a sword is 1ds. What's that S? What is your size die? If you're 6, it's a 1d6. If it's an 8, it's 1d8. So that's what the size die is. Amazons are considered medium. They have a d6 and dark vision of none. Um, I'll go ahead. Dark vision. Let's start that, even though they have none. Palladium, first edition, 13 races. 11 of them have some type of dark vision. 11 of 13. Humans don't have it, and changelings don't have it. And I think that's absolutely absurd and hilarious at the same time. And again, uh, any complaints I have, I guess you could say, any frustrations or hilarious or absurdness, it's my personal subjective opinion. Other people might have their own opinion that is valid in their games for their group, etc. But I'm looking at it like this. Palladium has a whole book back there called The Isle at the Edge of the World that goes through all of these trials and tribulations to figure out if people are changelings in a group. All this running because changelings have low physical endurance. They can't handle salt, very similar to witches, which was never explained in the original book. So you go forever, and then all of a sudden you bring out, hey, are you eating salted pork? Now you get sick. Never happened for over 10 years, and all of a sudden they throw out a book way late in the run, and they change the rules. And so the test for changelings is, are you something not human that can see in the dark? If you can't, if you can't see in the dark, then you are a changeling. So all changelings would be human all the time. It makes no sense at all to me. The So that was factor number one. Factor number two about my decision about dark vision, night vision, whatever you want to call it, is that I watched, and yes, I look around at different YouTube channels. I watched a YouTube channel from Dungeon Craft, which is one of my favorite channels to watch. Professor Dungeon Master was talking about old school. Old school is my third key. The reason, the setting of my system is to be more old school, which is resource counting. And resources are torches and lanterns and things like that. How long can I be in the dungeon before I need to leave? Because I don't have natural night vision, dark vision. Also, it's scary. It's supposed to be scary in dungeons, not just everything's lit up and we walk around. So I decided to cut out a lot of the species with night to cut their night vision, dark vision. I think I call it. I believe it's night vision in Palladium, but I decided to cut it out, and instead I give them bonuses to perception. So something like a dog cannot see if it's pitch black. If you put them in a room and close the door and there's no windows or anything, they can't see. The same thing with the cat. They can see extremely well in low light, but not in dark. So I gave them a bonus. Those type of species based off of those animals, I gave them a perception bonus and got rid of dark vision. Dark vision I see as things for species that live underground or have some connection to something that has it. And we'll go on there. But even though that kind of goes with species later, I saw that up here is dark vision and why I decided to cut a lot of dark vision from the different species. And that also allows the changeling to do what the changeling does, which is impersonate other species. And then any special abilities they have, I put there. And I gave every species some type of special ability if they didn't already have it. Palladium had some things where you do have those that D10 for the very large that I gave. Um, how is that offset? So I would give certain things special abilities, or some would get bite attacks, like say a wolf and gets a bite attack or something like that. So I wanted every species to have something. So here for the Amazon is once per day, which is 24 hours. So you use it, you wait 24 hours. An Amazon may re-roll a d20 that would be used for a weapon attack or parry. Basically, it's a second chance. Um, so that, or say using inspiration in D&D 5th edition terms, they try it once, whether they succeed or fail, they can't try again for 24 hours. So that is their special. They are the physical, kind of the physical peak of humanness through that mystical potion. And then my chart here is also to give a size comparison. You can always say this person's 3 foot and this person's 12 foot, but until you actually get a visual, it can be very difficult to determine. So this is my overall species kind of chart on how uh, various physical heights and kind of builds of the species. So let's move on. Um, the Avi, I thought people might like a, a avian race, a species. Again, I will slip. I will. Decades of having a certain term in your head will cause you to do that, no matter how much you try to do it differently. So, Avi, a bird humanoid species that their wings are actually attached to their arms. So when they're flying, they're actually flapping their arms. So you really can't fly and hit things that way, but they have clawed feet, so they can claw with their feet. Plus, I uh, give them a knife-like weapon, a spur that they can attach to their feet and use that in flight. They do when they fly. They get a speed bonus, and I'll explain that later. But I took away the speed attribute of Palladium and have it based off of physical prowess. I think most fantasy games out there will have it tied to whatever their version of dexterity or agility is. I just didn't see the need for an entire attribute just for movement. So that was one that I mostly just condensed out of not seeing a definite need for something that is a different attribute for one purpose that had no bonuses to anything else. It would even say speed, no bonuses except for the raw natural ability to run. Didn't see a purpose of that. Cut it out. Maybe you see a purpose of it and want to leave it. But basically, when they fly faster than most things would move at their normal speed. Not by a lot, but by some. They are considered small. They're about dwarf size, not dwarf bigness, muscularity, but height wise. So they get a D4, and they don't get a dark vision, but they get those natural claws, and they get a plus 3 to, I think that's what it says, +3 to perception. um, because again, I wanted to get rid of the every species except for humans and changelings has dark vision, but in replace of that, if they would be of a species that would have good eyesight, give them a bonus to perception. So that is the Avi. Kanan or Wolfen. It's just an back as a teenager after I read Palladium, fell in love with Wolfen, like most people who read Palladium fall in love with Wolfen, and I started writing novels. Now, none of them have been published or anything like that, but even back then, I understood copyright IP type things, and I decided to call them Kanan to get rid of any type of copyright thing. The idea of a wolf like humanoid is not unique. The name Wolfen possibly could be, and the way that Palladium likes to trademark and trademark everything out there that they use, I just decided to call them Canaan. So basically, off of Canine, because I was very clever as a middle teenager, but they are large. they get the size die of a D8, no dark vision, and I give them the bite and a natural armor rating of 6. That's not something I think is obvious in the main book, but when you look in the Palladium Monster and Animals book, they do have a natural armor rating of 6. So normally a natural armor rating of 4 for humans and other just say skin people, just just soft fleshy skin without thick fur or something like that. That means a 1 through a 4 completely misses, and a 5 or above is going to hit, whether it hits your armor or not. And a natural armor rating of 6 means 1 through 4 is a complete miss. You didn't even get hit. 5 and a 6 hit your fur, maybe shaved you a little bit, but didn't penetrate it enough to do damage. So that is what the 6 there. And the +8 to the hunting skill, and I just gave a little dogs really can't see much in color, so they can't, but they get a +2 to perception due to nose, hearing, and that. So that is my Canaan. My dwarf is one of 2 species that have a little twist, you could say, in the size die. We'll get to that, but dwarves on my world do not have that opposition to magic. That is a cultural thing on the Palladium world. Uh, a lot of the this species cannot be this occupation in Palladium First Edition is both uh, one of the reasons is Palladium World's mythology, which does not apply. The other is things that I didn't agree with, which I explained about the weapons. Dwarves could be longbowmen. There would have a bow that would be a little bit above their height. It would just be considered maybe a normal bow to a large creature or a medium creature, but to them it is a longbow. Why couldn't they be a longbow and that type of thing? But for dwarves, they're small. Normally they would have a D4 size die, but I do like the idea of dwarves. They are the sturdy, very powerful warrior-ish species. So when they are in melee weapons that they use, they get a D8. They count as a large. Um, Now, with their bows and crossbows are going to be smaller, more compact. Then they get the D4, like their size would uh, denotate. But when they are using melee weapons, they count as large. So that is the way. So the dwarves are tough, and they, even though they're short, they're very sturdy. They do as much as a Canaan, a wolfen. The ability that I added to them was any path that they walk, so not flying or on a cart or riding a donkey or something like that. But if they walk a path, they can always remember it, and that's how they can navigate underground. Um, since they live underground, they are one of the few species that I actually do give dark vision. So they get dark vision, they can remember any path that they've walked, which I will give a shout out. That comes from um, the Mythgar series by Raymond D. Feist. I really like the explanations of why dwarves didn't weren't able to. They could understand if they went a path, they would always be able to walk that path again. And I do believe something similar, if not the exact same thing, is through Dennis L. McKiernan, the Brega Path, one of the dwarves who walked a path and was able afterwards to write out exactly how, or have it written down. He might have spoke it, but it was written down exactly his path. So that was a thing that I've read in novels I really liked and put it into the game. And because also of their sturdiness, their powerfulness, they are able to carry and lift equivalent to a very large, so they can lift as much as a troll could with the same physical strength, but their speed is reduced. I wanted to give them a physical prowess, being deft, being able to strike, being very martial. Wanted not to lower that, but they're short, so they they don't run as fast. So unlike the Avi, which get a bonus while they're flying, dwarfs are decreased by one. So that is what the dwarves are. When we go over here and go to the next page, so lots of fantasy games out there have their different version of elves. Whether it is a D&D where you have like uh, Forgotten Realms has all these different types of moon elves and this elf and drow out there. Other ones will have their version of the high elves or the wood elves, and then the dark elves, etc. My split of the elves are elves that have inherent magic within them and the elves who have lost that ability of magic. So to make things very difficult and only and I found it amusing to me at least. I find it amusing that the people who choose to be an elf or an elf, the difference being an F or a V, elves being plural and elves being plural for the two different ones. So basically, one has an F, one has a V. The people that care about it are the ones who play those species, and everybody else doesn't even care and will just say don't care. But elves are the ones with inherent magic. They are all adepts. They are all able to do magic and innate magic, which is they can get some magic stuff and some psychic abilities, and they have not lost that, and the elves have lost it, but they are a little more stronger physically and things like that. Why this type of break? I actually liked the Beck Me had the old school D&D, BX, Beck Me, etc. had the elves that were a fighter magic user type combination. I've used that on my world. I thought that was interesting. That's where the elf came from. The elf comes from the Hollow World elves that had lost the ability of magic, so they took a different thing. I kind of took those two. Have had that in my mythology for Zordaria for a long time, and that is where that comes from. It's something that I like. Both species are medium D6s. Neither one of them have night vision. Uh, the elves, being magical, have a +1 to saving throw versus spells, wards, circles, and psychic abilities, and +1 to perception. And they all know a life source spell. That's something that I really liked. There was the game I've talked about before, Adventure Quest. They had an offshoot of their fantasy that used hit points in the place of spell points. So you actually got weaker. I kind of like that type of thing. I liked Dennis Olmey-Kiernan again. His wizards used their life force. They actually grew older as they cast spells, and then they would rest and get younger. They were somewhat immortal in that way. I've always had elves be able to use life points, hit points to power spells in my own game Dunamis, and I found in Rifts this life source spell which does that, allows you to use your hit points to fuel spells. And instead of reinventing the wheel, I'm doing a Palladium game. Rifts is a Palladium game. Take that spell, altered it as needed, and inserted it into Palladium, my Palladium First Edition home rules. So that's where that comes from. And the elves being a little more physical, they get a +1 to speed, so they run a bit faster. And then again, elves have good eyesight, +1 to perception. The fallen or fallen angels. It comes from Deva or the Devo, however you want to pronounce that, from D&D. And again, to get away from trademark copyright type things, call them the fallen. They are angels that fell. The difference there is they actually do have wings, unlike the Deva from Palladium, or sorry, from D&D Fourth Edition, which had these little fake little wings that they wore. That at least in all the pictures you would see these little weird fake wings that were like miniature, tiny. I decided to make them flying. They're one of the 3 flying species. They don't get any other bonuses though. The Avi, if you remember, they get the clawed feet, They can do damage. They fly a bit faster, and since they have bird head, they get that bonus to perception. The fallen don't. They can wield weapons in their hands, and they're medium size, so they're D6 weapons. They get flight. So that is kind of that's their big thing. They can fight and fly at the basically humans with wings. The feline is something that I never had originally. I did not have a feline. Beckme, Isle of Dread, had Rakashas, which were a not the Rakshasa from the tiger like evil monster creatures, but they were more of just cat people. Cat people are in a lot of fantasy games. Palladium even has a cat people. I can't recall the name. I believe it starts with a K. Kennygear, maybe. Might have various ones. But while I personally uh, don't have an opinion either way to play or not play a cat person. I know cat people are very popular, so that's why I added them. Kind of like Jenny wanted to be a bear person, so I added them. And so that is the feline, kind of like where the Canaan come from canine, feline comes from feline, because even now I have very unique, I come up with great unique names that nobody would ever think about. um, the feline, I have them as medium. I didn't want them to just be Canaan that are cats. I didn't want them to be wolfen that are cats, so I made them medium size. I do allow them to be any type of cat. So the wolfen is a wolf, and I don't have the cankerin and the coils of Palladium First Edition. Although they are cool, unique things, I decided to just keep with the wolf. The feline, though, you can be a tiger, you can be a lynx, you could be a Siamese cat, a Maine Coon, a whatever, any type of cat species, from domesticated to wild to big cats. Any of those you can be. You just tell me what type it is, and they don't get any extra bonuses. It's just you look different. So here I basically have a house cat as the female and a tiger as the male, just to show that that's how it could be very different. Um, and they get retractable claws that give them also a plus 10% to scale walls. And again, taking away night vision or not giving them night vision, they get a plus 3 to perception. Here we have Gelfkin. I've explained before, I don't like gnomes, I don't like hobbits, don't like halflings. I do love Waros from Dennis Olman Kiernan's Mythgar series. I really like Gelflings from the Dark Crystal. Why that is, I don't know. I don't know why those two I like and the other ones I don't, but I usually take gnomes or halflings from D&D, Palladium, whatever, and I just say you can use these stats, but you're a Gelfkin. You're not hobbits. You're not halflings. You're not gnomes. So that is what the Gelfkin is. Gelfkins are, they look similar to elf children, but they're not. And they're really, really good with a bow. So they're the other switch for the size die. Melee, they get the D4s, and when they're using bows, they get a D8. Not because the weapon's any bigger, unlike kind of the dwarves. The dwarves can carry those larger weapons or put more oomph behind it. It's just they're really good. They pinpoint. They're going to hit your heart. They're going to hit you between the eyes. They are just going to do naturally. They are just better archers. So they get the D8 for the bows. They also get a plus 10 to prowl and a plus 2 to perception. Basically, I'm pretty sure I took the attribute dice from the gnomes from Palladium and did that, and gnomes have a dark vision, so again I switched that dark vision over and just gave them a uh, bonus to perception. Goblins, I took the goblins from Palladium, I took the hobgoblins and had them as an offshoot of goblins instead of their own separate species. And then I took the cobbler as kind of the opposite offshoot. So goblins in Palladium and in my own world have a fairy background. So the ones closest to the fairy background are the in Palladium they called cobblers. They were ones that at third level they got a few spells that they were able to cast, and then it was just and they could transform into some type of small animal creature like a rat or a possum or something like that. And that was kind of a bonus. They made it a random uh, die roll, which I've played games and I've enjoyed games that have the random concept, but I don't like it when certain things are random. That you pick a species, but then other parts of that determine whether you get something or not. So if I'm playing a goblin, I can see a lot of people choosing the goblin specifically because they would like to play a cobbler. And then when they roll and they don't get it, then they are a goblin without that thing that they wanted. So I have it where you can be the base goblin, you can be the goblin closer to the fairies, which I call gobbo fairies. I just didn't want to call them cobblers. Or you could go one that's more away from the fairy background, and that's where the hobgoblin. Hobgoblins are exact same attributes as in Palladium, but I just make them an offshoot of goblins instead of their own species type thing. So the base goblin is small, a d4. They do get dark vision again. They are underground normally. They have that fairy background. So it's only 30 feet. It's lesser than a lot of the other ones that do have it, even though there's not a lot that do have it. But they do have a dark vision. They get a even bigger bonus to prowl because they're more sneaky gets than the Gelfkin. They do more critical damage. Basically, when they know how to backstab, they know how to backstab. Basically, how I do the backstab rules, because you never really understand how combinations work in Palladium. They'll give you a rule and they'll give you a rule, but they don't explain how they interact. So if you have a normal backstab is double damage, and then they have other types of criticals. So critical double damage. What happens when you have two double damages is that 4 times. I have it 3. Each one adds a multiplier to it. So a normal critical would be double. They automatically make it triple. And if they backstab and then they roll a natural critical and they're a goblin, they're at 3. So they're always going to get one multiplier higher just from being the goblin. That is one of their major things, and why the D4 isn't so bad when you stack it with other things, like say a thief or an assassin goblin would wreak mayhem on something if they're in the right position. So they get the plus uh, the plus 3 times, sorry, times 3 damage on a normal crit, and other multipliers would increase that by 1. And if they choose to reduce one of their dice, like say they have a PE of 4, if they would like to roll 3d6 instead of 4d6, then they can gain the abilities of the Gobbo Fairy. So that is something. Instead of making it that random thing, I still take away something. You just don't be a Gobbo Fairy. You have to offset that by something. So it's a reduction of your dice. And then the Gobbo fairies. Basically, Palladium had that old school kind of failure of the X many spells per day. Which, what does that mean? Does it mean that as soon as you cast a spell, you start timing it for 24 hours? Does that mean like modern D&D, where you take a long rest or you sleep for X many hours, you wake up and then you're refreshed? But then everybody, what happens? How do you limit that? And there's all those things. No, you can only sleep 1 time a day. Well, why can't I? Well, then we'll just wait, etc., etc. For sleeping and that. I have it certain things like I talked about before with the Amazon special ability. That is a literal 24 hours. It happens. You cannot do it for a 24-hour period. For spells, I tend to look at it as a, especially the Fey type spells. Are you good or are you an evil Fey? If something's good, it will reset at sunrise. And yes, in the summer it'll be earlier, in the winter it will be later, but sunrise. It has a good feeling of daylight. And the evil side would be sunset. That's where it resets. So that's where my 24-hour or once a day or 24 times per day or one spell per day, whatever, that per day thing resets a lot in my house rules as sunrise or sunset, depending on what that came from. Gabo fairies are usually from a evil side of fairy, the unseelie court, or however you pronounce that. So they would reset at sunset, I believe, unless I specifically said otherwise in this. So once per, or basically, I gave them the same spells that cobblers get from Palladium. They're a natural ability, which each spell can be cast twice per day from sunset to sunset. So it resets at sunset. At sunset, these powers refresh, allowing another two castings for each spell, but it doesn't add. So if you don't cast those two and you hit sunset, you don't automatically get four. You still only have two. So that's what I did there. Hobgoblins are a little more. They're larger. They're considered medium. So that's where the difference. The ones that are more towards the Fey do the magic, but they take away an attribute dice. The goblins are the small, but they backstab a lot. The hobgoblins are up to medium, human size. They still retain the dark vision, and their special ability is any melee weapon proficiency skill, not ranged or thrown, is considered a level higher. So they are the martial type side. That's where they kind of go. And that's, even though hobgoblins come directly from Palladium, I made them an offshoot of Goblin instead of their own separate species. But that little special ability, because a lot of these special abilities are not in Palladium, but as I said, I did want to give certain ones special abilities, especially when you have like just a natural troll from Palladium doing a ton of damage. I wanted something out there so there's not one species that's just like this species better all the time. The hobgoblin from D&D has more martial type mentality of armies and stuff like that, and that's where I gave it. You get it at a level higher. Human are basic, 3d6 in all stats, but I did want to give them that special thing. Why would you be a human? You get a plus 10% to the streetwise skill. Humans are social animals. I wanted to bring that in. And once per 24 hours, so that means, yes, that is a 24-hour set. Uh, you can re-roll one non-combat skill. So if you roll a percentile skill that's not involved in a combat, whether it's cooking or hunting or whatever, you can re-roll it. You can kind of second guess yourself or change your mind at the last minute, that type of thing. So that's what humans are. Kobolds, I've said before, very similar to how I think about Gelfkins, and I don't necessarily like hobbits and stuff. I don't dislike Palladium kobolds. I also, there, which are kind of like a weird goblin dwarf mix in Palladium. There is the old school D&D where they're dog like, and then there's the new school D&D where they're reptilian like. And my favorite out of all versions is the reptilian one. So that is the reason why I have them as the reptilian version. Is just because out of all the choices out there, that's the one that I like the most. So they're small. They do the D4 is their size die. They also live underground. Gave them the dark vision. That's why. Um, and I do like the idea, which is both in D&D and in Palladium, of they're like second only to dwarves in manufacturing weapons and knowing how to make traps. D&D, they like doing, at least fourth edition, they like setting traps and making contraptions and things like that. And in Palladium, they were only second to dwarfs in making arms and armor. So I give them a plus 10% to recognize weapon quality, blacksmith skills. Because of their scales, they have a natural armor rating of 8, higher than the Canaan of 6. And they get a damage bonus of +1 for manufactured weapons. So when they have a manufactured weapon, they just know how to use it better and will get a +1 bonus to damage. It's not a ton, but it's enough that they know how to use that weapon effectively. Better than, since they're a crafter, even though they uh, could have, claws just doing a normal d4 of damage, they are smarter when it comes to sticking somebody with a weapon. Crystallins are medium size, so human size, crystalled rock people. Even though Obsidian and Earth Dawn are larger, I wanted to have that type of flavor for people who like the Obsidian, as well as Mind Shards from D&D 4th edition, which were medium. And I didn't want to have a ton of species that were just very large and large. I wanted to narrow the edges, have more medium, again, to balance out the why would anybody play a medium character if you have all of these large choices that are just so much better. So crystallins are medium, no dark vision. Um, and their weird thing is they have a very high armor rating of 15, which is pretty good in Palladium. Palladium have maybe 2 armors that are higher, natural armors that are higher, but being natural means it won't ever be, the armor won't be hurt. So if it the roll is 15 or under, because defender always makes ties in Palladium, whether that's a saving throw or defense or a parry, the attacker has to get higher. So an armor rating of 15 means you need a 16 to hit. It's not D&D where that's the target number. You have to get higher than that in Palladium. So a 1 through 4 is a complete miss, and a 5 through a 15 is you hit the crystalline again, because I'm very original with my names, crystals. um, you hit, it just doesn't do damage. It doesn't penetrate that rocky skin. But they can't wear armor. The armor, basically, if something's constantly pressed against them, it will absorb into them. That is their way of eating. Their nourishment is to basically absorb armors, and they can't be healed with a normal healing touch. They need Mend Stone. They can heal naturally using the natural healing rules, but they will not heal with, say, a cleric healing touch or a priest healing touch. To give them an offset against that very large armor rating. Minotaurs are one of the 3 very large species, so they get a D10. No night vision. Again, I took that away. They are not the Minotaurs of Palladium, which are worshippers and servants of the old ones. They are the D&D 4th edition optional player character species of Minotaur. And basically, their horns do 2d10, which is a pretty significant damage without a PS bonus. You can't get those strength muscles when you're just using your head, but still 2d10 is pretty good. And whenever I get rid of dark vision or something, I give a bonus to perception. So they get a +1 to perception, and uh, bovines are pretty perceptive. They can see a lot of things. Also, I did a lot of Google's searches trying to see, how do cows actually see things. We move on. Orcs. Orcs are kind of very straight from the Palladium first edition rule book. All the attribute dice again are the same. Medium D6s. Took away dark vision. because unlike goblins, they are not in caves underground dwellers. They get their bite with no PS. Basically, if it's a bite, I got rid of PSs. If it's claw, you can use your PS or punch. Negative 20% to checks, which is a bonus. You subtract that from what you roll based on scent. I really like the idea of orcs, while not visually or hearing, like, say, a wolfen, a Canaan, or felin, or something like that. Their perception is through smelling. So if they're trying to track something by smell, they get a 20% bonus to that. And if they are fighting something invisible, basically, I mentioned earlier, Palladium has lots of different rules if you're blind. -8 over here, -10 over here. I took a lot of those numbers and turned them into conditions called off. And there's 3 types of off. There's slightly off, there's off, and there's very off. And I just like the idea of like waking up one day and go, man, I'm slightly off today. And that's something that, so those are kind of, or I'm off today, I'm very off today. So basically, it's a -2 penalty, strike, parry, and dodge for being slightly. Just being off is -5, strike, parry, and dodge. And very off is your -10, strike, parry, and dodge. And so normally, if you're fighting an invisible foe, you would have that condition, and they ignore it if they can smell the opponent. They can sense, smell, and know where that is. And they may re-roll 1 saving throw. So versus magic, or just consider orcs very hardy, very resistant to magic, to poison, to whatever. And if they fail, they can choose to re-roll, and that's another one of those 24 hours. So it's done, you wait 24 hours, and +4 to perception as a bonus for that, getting rid of that dark vision. Sarns. Sarns are not necessarily that I dislike troglodytes. It's just I always have Sarns in my game, a lizard-like person. Um, I took Dragonborn in 4th edition and made them Sarns, because Sarns is a species that I have in all my games. They are based off of AQ Jarn, Adventure Quest Jarn had lizard people. They're just known as lizards, and I've just always had that. That is your, whether it's your Tuskrang from Earth Dawn or your Troglodyte from Palladium, they are the large lizard people. So they are a D8, being a large. They get a bite. They get a tail attack. They can actually put a mace on their tail and use that. And they can use actually the weapon proficiency mace with that. And like the kobold's scale armor rating of 8, they get an armor rating of 8. We move on to the shifter. The shifter is my version of the changeling. I changed it a little bit. They kind of look like cartoony, bulgy-eyed, bald-headed things. People, Popeye-ish, I guess you could even call it, in Palladium. I wanted them to have a completely different natural form. So they're kind of like a droopy, where skin kind of hangs off, or jello-y, melty type thing. So that is the shifter. I gave more rules for the shifter and how those rules could be changed, because Palladium has a really weird thing. Shifter or changelings in Palladium have a physical beauty of 2d6, which is pretty low. Elves, who are what changelings a lot of times will become in a Palladium system, have like a 4d6 or even a 5d6. I can't remember, but it's a lot higher. And when you read the changeling rules, they only change their appearance, not their attributes. So if you rolled, say, a 3 and a 3, or 3 and a 4, 7, for a changeling in Palladium, you would be an ugly elf. And I just thought that was kind of strange. And also, being able to just say, oh, they can be whatever they want, also seemed a little strange, I think, with experience. So what I did is, whenever they assume a new species for the first time, they roll that species physical beauty stat. So if they would go for that elf, that let's just, I guess I could look what an elf is, or an elf. Let's use an elf. Elf physical beauty is 5. Okay. So the changeling, the shifter, decides to take the form of an elf, and they would roll 5d6. And for every level that they are, they can either boost it by that point up to 30 or lower it by that many. So if they're level 3, and say off of the 5d6, say they roll a 20, then they could be anywhere from a 17 to a 23, and they would choose anytime they would assume an elf form. And then say that they went to an orc is a PB of 2. So even though the shifter has a PB of 2 naturally, they would still roll those 2d6 to get a base for that orc. And again, if they're third level, they could adjust that plus or minus 3. So that is kind of the shifter. Um, Kept them without dark vision, but now there's tons of stuff out there without dark vision. So that is normal. And I do allow, basically, if they switch to a size category, it's going to take them a little bit until they get the D size. So if they shrink until from a medium to a small, they don't immediately have the D4. They kind of maybe have a little more mass, so they will lose weight until they get down to that. Or the opposite, if say that they would become a troll, it would take them a while to amass that weight again to get up to that D8 and then D10. So basically, I think I said it is a size die per one per week. So in 2 weeks, they could go from that medium shifter to the very large troll in the D6, or sorry, from the D6 to the D10. Although they would look like a troll, they just wouldn't have that density there. And then that's it. That's their special thing, which I think is a big special thing. The sprites are kind of the fairies from the back of the book, as well as the, even though it's really weird, again, there are certain things that I don't understand about myself, why I really never liked fairies, but I love me some windlings in Earth Dawn. And out of playing Earth Dawn First Edition, Earth Dawn Second Edition, Earth Dawn Fourth Edition, in each edition I've had at least one, sometimes two windlings as player character. Like my character has been a windling. It started off as a windling in First Edition, was two different windlings in Second Edition, and currently I'm playing a windling. So something about windlings I like, and didn't necessarily like fairies, but it's something. The sprite is out there for people who like fairy windling, that type of thing. Let's try to get this a little bit. Nope, it's just there. A little bit better on the page. Um, they're the last flying species. They can see in dark vision. That's based off of their Fey background, their fairy background. They get a lot of less attribute dice because they will get natural spellcasting abilities, much like the Gobbo fairy, and they can fly, and they're small. So they are very small, actually. So they're a D3 instead of a D4. They are the one player species that is the very small category. But they do get dark vision. They get the abilities of flying, and they get the day side instead of the night side. So Gobbo fairies are kind of from the the bad side of fairies. Things reset at sunset. For the sprites, they reset at sunrise. And here, basically, they get to choose one of the um, three different types of flower fairies: the marigold, two-winged, silverbell, water lotus, and lady slipper. And that would determine which spells that they get. All at level 3, they basically they get them at level 1 and they increase until level 3, and at level 3 they just stay that way. So they do get a natural spell casting. So that offsets a lot of their physical abilities, like physical strength and physical endurance of the 1d6. So they will have very low uh, physical endurance, physical strength for the most part, but they do get these spell casting abilities. Sylvan are based off of treants, tree people. Um, I cannot recall what it is in D&D fourth edition. There is a species that was in the third player handbook that was a plant based species, and that kind of comes into to play, a dryad or sylvan type creature. And basically they are similar to the rock people, except for their tree people. They're medium d6s, no dark vision, but they are immune to all charm. So charm effects, mystical and mundane, do not affect them, although the animate plants type effects will be considered like charm effects, and they have a natural armor rating because of their mark of a 6. And you might say, oh, they're not vulnerable or something to fire. No, tree, anybody who has made campfires know that a living tree that you cut off a piece of wood is extremely hard. Wet wood, not have been setting out drying for a long time, is extremely hard to catch fire. So I don't necessarily agree with all the stuff out there making wood creatures more vulnerable to fire. Speaking of fire, we have Teuflings. Teuflings has been brought up in play, and there is a recording of one of our sessions when somebody is talking about why this stupid name for a tiefling. Tiefling has a very strange trademark. Paizo Pathfinder can get by it using the OSR for their specific rules, but from what I've read, and I'm not a copyright lawyer or anything like that, but I do a lot of reading about copyrights because I do writing, and I have my own game, Dunamis, which is copyrighted. There is something about the name within certain works that the IP is a Hasbro Wizards of the Coast owned thing. Maybe it's with novels. I've never read any Paizo novels, but maybe certain like rules you can say it, but when you do other things you can't say it. Um, Teufel is German for devil, so calling them devilings, Teufelings, seemed just appropriate to once again take a sidestep for any type of copyright, trademark, IP shenanigans. So that is why I did that. Being a devil offshoot, they do get a dark vision. Um, Again, I was trying to come up with you need a really good reason to have dark vision, and that fit being infernal. Dark vision, heat does not affect them, fire does half damage. They are medium, so that is kind of their thing. They take less damage from fire and they can see in the dark, and just heat doesn't affect them. Trolls are basically straight from Palladium. Trolls get a lot of benefits naturally from Palladium, so I didn't feel a need to change them in any way. They get a bite, they get a punch that is pretty decent, a 2d6, plus they can add their big strength bonus, and that is a troll. Trolls are just big monsters. And then we have Ursins. Ursins are bear. They call them bear men, and then Jenny was like bear woman, and instead of calling them bear people, along with Crystallins and Sylvans, which means wood, and Canaan and Phelan, let's just call them Ursins, for being Ursines, the bear type people. If Minotaur was not a actual word, I probably would call them bovins, to be honest. Um, the Ursins are from the Palladium monster and animal, straight from it. And I did have a lot of Second thoughts about it. I know Jenny really wanted to be a bear person, and I really wanted her to do that. And I had the second edition, and they just seemed very overpowered compared to first edition species. And then when I got the first edition Monster and Animals, the copy that I had got lost, destroyed, something like that in the past. And Mars is back. He says, I've been talking too long. We're getting there, Mars. We are getting there. Um, the bear people, the bear men in that game had a lot of natural abilities far greater than anything in the main book. And if you look at the abilities here, they get a bite, they get claws, and yes, the damage has changed to fit my system, but they had a natural armor rating of 11, which is really high when you look at the Wolfen. The Canaan is a 6, and even the ones with scales is an 8, and the 11 is high, and I really thought to lower that. And then they have all these natural skills that were bonuses to prowl and hunting and swimming and stuff like that. So what I decided to do is, instead of cutting all of that stuff and making it different, was to make it natural that never increased. So like prowl, 28%, it's flat. Somebody else might start with a prowl skill, it might be lower, but at some point they're going to get higher than that 28%. And if the Urson, if the bear person chooses prowl, that 28 doesn't add to it. They take whatever the highest is. So that 28 at some point will be surpassed if they have the skill, but then it won't mean anything. So basically, that is what it is. They did have a night vision. I did take away that to give them a 2. I did forget the trolls. I did leave. They're in a large underground, very large, I guess, underground type of species, so I did leave the dark vision for them. But the Urson, I gave them a +2 to perception, and I did just decide to let them, basically because they are very large, I let them keep that natural skin toughness, fur toughness, whatever, of 11. I think maybe it's because if they get attacked, maybe they'll just get mad and it just doesn't seem to affect them. And that's kind of what that armor rating is as well. So those are all of my species. So there are a lot more than the normal 13 from Palladium, but I added a lot either because they were in other games that I'd used on that world, or something that I knew that a lot of people liked those type of species and kept. Um, so the second part of part one um, should hopefully go a little faster, which is attributes, hit points, and shock points. Attributes are the same as Palladium. They are, except for speed. I remove speed, but everything else, IQ, ME, MA, PS, PE, PB, PP, are all the same. They use the same chart that was in every single Palladium book, except for maybe Recon, which is completely different rules, and maybe the Valley of the Pyramids, I think, might be completely different rules. But any normal Palladium game has one chart, and it's the exact same as all of those charts. You take your species, it tells you how many dice to roll. You roll those dice, and that is your number. If you roll if you're rolling one die, which is different because Palladium didn't have any species that only had one die, or they didn't explain it for the fairies sprites. If you roll a d6 and you roll a 6, you get to roll an extra d6 and add to it. It's a one-time thing, not keep rolling every time a 6, but it's one time. So normally you'd have between a 1 and a 5. If you roll a 6, you might get a 1, make it a 7, or you might get a 6 and get a 12. So 12 would be the absolute maximum, and it would be very hard to get, but it is theoretically possible. Um, Palladium had it where if you roll 2 dice and roll a 12, then you got that same type of thing, and I kept that. And on 3 dice, if you rolled a 17 or 18, then you got to roll an extra one and keep it. But on 4 or 5 or 6 dice, you didn't. I kept all of that exactly the same. So you'll see that down here under exceptional rolls. You'll see that it is exactly the same for the 2D, 3D, and the 4D 6 to 66. So hit points. I liked Palladium First Edition, which only had hit points for people, and SDC was for items such as armor, doors, things, magic walls, or normal walls that you made. When SDC was added in such games as Heroes Unlimited, it made sense. Heroes, superheroes, especially in comic books and modern TV, even though you wouldn't even imagine the special effects that could be done back then. It was all in your head. But superheroes can take a beating. SDC made sense in those games. When they, and this is all my opinion, when they take the SDC and put it into games such as Palladium Fantasy World for their second edition, in my opinion, it messed things up for many reasons. One is each species they gave a base SDC, well, for certain ones. So normally here, if you would look, trolls are much better physically than humans. But humans and trolls were one that they could be any specific occupations. They didn't have any no, you can't be this being a troll. You could be a troll paladin. When Bob made Sir Emery troll paladin, he is using Palladium rules. That's not something that I let him do. It is something that is within Palladium. A troll paladin is always going to be better than a human paladin because of just what they roll. When you give them a ton of SDC on top of that, that makes it even more so. And then Palladium Second Edition, you would have their skills that add to physical attributes as well as adding SDC. So you pick some boxing, some wrestling, some physical fitness type skills, and each one of those is adding more and more SDC. It is adding more to their physical endurance, which adds to their hit points. It makes it so that the difference between a human paladin and a troll paladin is it goes from this to a lot larger gap, to a point where, in my opinion, a troll wizard is a better fighter than a human paladin because of just how tough they are. And there's that old thing that I've talked about many times in Palladium where armor SDC is much less than their later games people SDC. So, let alone when I was playing Palladium First Edition, and I had a player who had armor, and his armor would get hit, and he would complain, and he's like, "Man, I just don't want to wear my armor anymore." And I was like, "Why would you not want to wear your armor?" And he's like, "Because this character can heal me, and it costs nothing, and to repair my armor takes time, it takes money, it takes resources, or I have to buy a whole new set of armor." And that's why I came up with my armor difference of SDC only takes damage either every 5 points of damage or 10 points of damage becomes SDC damage in keeping those hit points. When you added that SDC to people, to characters, then they could have, say a troll have 80 SDC, which is as much as, or like double what chainmail would have. And it just, to me, was mind-boggling how much more physically durable a troll is than a human, and how they're even better than metal armor. So one of the things I did like about certain Palladium things was the bypassing of SDC. So if you had like a death blow, it would bypass your SDC and hit your hit points directly. And I did like that concept. So for things like any mystical ability with death, whether it's Evil Eye Death, Death Spell, the Death Ward, um, or mundane things like a Death Blow, Assassin Death Blow, basically if it has death in the name, I wanted it to be able to bypass something and go to hit points. So, also, another thing that I find lacking in a lot of games is the premise that you're physically perfect until you're dead. You in D&D are fighting, and no matter how low you get, it doesn't matter until you're at zero, and then you're making death saves. And I really like the idea of some negatives being happening at some point in time. And in my game Dunamis, I had life points, which were a hit point replacement that never went up. They were based off of species, and that's what they were. And you could add shock points to it. And Palladium First Edition has the everybody gets a d6 in hit points per level. And I decided, what if I kept hit points as your physical endurance, which was the base, and then you would add a d6 for every level, including level 1, and add to it. What if you had that as just your hit points? And certain occupations or things might raise that a little here and there, not a lot, but your base is that. And instead of getting hit points per level, you get shock points. And shock points are different than SDC because SDC is talking about structural damage capacity structures, armor, walls, doors, things like that. And depending on the material it's made out of, if you swing your sword and you hit that thing, if it's a softer material, such as light armor, for every 5 points of damage, so say you hit and you did exactly 10 points of damage, you would do 2 SDC to that softer material. And if it was a harder material, such as heavy armors, armor, plate and chain, etc., then you would take 1 point for every 10 damage, 1 SDC point for every 10 damage. So that same 10 points of hit damage swinging that sword would only do 1 SDC. But against flesh, if it gets through over your armor rating, whether that's natural or not, the shock points, it's going to do that full 10. So that is the reason I came up with shock points, and they're different than SDC. I wanted that SDC to be that harder material that doesn't just go away, doesn't make you want to not wear armor, makes you want to be hit. And that has just worked amazing. The last system I did was timesing SDC by 10. So armor that was a 160, I believe, is plate armor, full plate. That would be 1,600 instead of 160. And it worked, but it was just a lot of. I mean, they both have math, but it was just dealing with lots of large numbers. And having that mitigation, that 10 go to a 1, so you see your 98, say you have 98 SDC, go to 97. There's some psychological aspect of it that seems more satisfying to my players instead of seeing a 1,600 go to 1,590. You're still taking all that damage, and you're watching big chunks of that armor go down instead of tiny chunks of the armor. And it's worked really well. That's like one of that in my magic point system is the two biggest things that I found have just worked wonderful. And adding that SD or the shock points instead of the additional hit points, you roll your d6 at the beginning, and that shock points that gets taken off first. But anything with that death type thing will go straight to your hit points, bypass your shock points. And if you have any hit point damage at all, even if it's bypass shock points, then you are considered wounded, and you basically have a -2 to strike, parry, and dodge, just to show that you are being affected by your life being threatened in a bloody, woundage way. Whether that is life force being taken out of you mystically, or having a large gash in you, or somebody hitting you in a really good, kidney shot or something like that. Um, and so far, I've been very happy. But that is the hit points and shock points, and why I didn't just have hit points and SDC like other Palladium games. I wanted SDC to be that structural. I wanted shock points to be there as a buffer, but certain things to be able to bypass that and directly affect hit points. Perception, Palladium has a perception system that is just roll this, and depending on what you roll, it's like a for average thing, for hard to see things, such like that. I tend to do a little differently, just very easy, easy, simple, average, hard, very hard, near impossible. Give those rates, and then task difficulty. Palladium system, um, and I've read differently depending on which book Kevin Sabita writes in, but there has been questions of what do I roll if I just want to roll against strength, if I don't want to roll against skill, and Palladium has published before two different systems. One is just take that and make it a percentile and roll percentile against it, and the other is take it by times it by two and roll percentile. And still, if you have a 15, which is a pretty decent strength, and you're trying to do something, rolling a percentage against 15 is pretty sad, and even against a 30 is pretty sad. I wanted to do something where you could do it off of stages and a game, because always look around, look at what other games do, see how they might affect your game. Adventure Quest Jarn did a d6s versus either skills or attributes, and normally a 3d6 was average. And in D&D, when I played, I don't know if this was actually a rule, but this is a rule that I played that then I transplanted into Palladium First Edition when I was rolling that, was you would roll a d20 against the attribute. So instead of that percentile against that 15, you would roll a d20 against the 15, which you would almost likely succeed. I like the idea of adding d6s for how difficult things are. So something very easy, it's going to be a 1d6. And if you have a 6 or better, don't worry about it. It's very easy, you do it. Something that's easy, or sorry, very easy, you don't even roll 0d6. Just you succeed. If it is easy, it's a d6. If you have a 1 through a 5 attribute, you're going to roll because you are weak. But if you have a 6 or better, you don't have to worry about easy tasks. You can do easy tasks. Why roll when it doesn't matter? Um, Simple is 2d6. Average is 3d6. So you might not succeed if you have that range, around 10 to 10ish. Um, Hard is 46. Very hard is 5d6, and near impossible is 66. If it's impossible, just say no. Sorry, you can't do it. But that gives different ranges that a game master can add those dice to determine a difficulty of a task under an attribute. And I like that. I've used it in, like I said, it is the standard way of doing things in Adventure Quest Jarn, and I transplanted it and put it into my Palladium rules. I go through the what the different attributes are, which are pretty close to what they are in Palladium. One thing I did change was how much you could carry and lift uh, based off of your PS. Basically, that was because the trolls could not carry their armor. In Palladium, they just have an armor chart and it is medium. And it doesn't troll, you would think if they're wearing plate, their plate's going to be heavier. But when you would convert a medium into a very large, the way the strength was just times 10 of your strength to be able to carry, trolls could not carry their own armor. Basically, so what I did was the smaller you get, the less times by the PS it is, and the bigger you are, is the times the multiplier increases. So whereas a human, medium-sized human, to be able to carry something would be 10 times their PS, and to lift it is 20 times their PS. A very large would be double that. A troll or a troll, a minotaur, or Urson would be 20 times to carry and 40 times to lift. And after implementing that, that seems to be working pretty decently. So that is one thing. I do have an encumbrance system because Palladium has an encumbrance, and they did have it, and it's pretty much from that. If you are carrying something is over what you can carry, but under what you can lift, you're encumbered, and you get some negatives to that. Physical prowess, as I said, is also it's the same as Palladium, but it also is the speed attribute. And one of the problems that a lot of people, especially virtual tabletops, people that as soon as they hit virtual tabletops with Palladium, the one of the first things that they will get stuck on is speed, because speed is very, very fast in Palladium, and you will have a huge map, and a character can get from one side to the other side in an action. The other thing, and I've probably mentioned it here, is that the way that speed works in Palladium is the more attacks you have, the slower you go per action. So if you have, unlike say D&D where you have a move action and then you do your attack action, which might entail different attacks, the way Palladium goes is those attacks go back and forth. You attack, and then they attack, and then you attack, and then they attack, and you parry, and you might give up your next action. I've made it to give up your last action to keep that back and forth going. But what that means is if you're trying to move between or as you're attacking, if you take your speed and you divide it by your attacks per melee round, the person, you can have two people that have the same speed. Say they have a speed of 10. We'll just use 10 as a normal number. You know, somebody with two attacks, they're moving 5 each round. The other one has 5, and they only move 2 each one of their turns. So each one of their turns is they get more turns, but they get smaller. And it comes up with problems, and especially when it's not 10. It's not like you move 10 squares or 10 feet. In Palladium, you move all across the board. But Palladium speed, the attribute speed, is the raw natural ability run. That's just the fastest you can go. If you were on a flat paved highway, or maybe even going downhill, that is how fast you go. That is not worrying about combat. That's not worrying about dodging, parrying. That is just how freaking fast you can go. I have that, but based off of physical prowess, as just running without complications, without obstacles, without combat. When things get into an obstacle or combative situation, then I rein it back. And then so there's basically combat running, combat movement, and non-combat. Non-combat is 20 meters or yards times your physical prowess. That is, I am just running to get there. Within combat, when you're trying to dodge, when you're trying to parry, when you're trying to tactically maneuver without getting hit, when you're just going over fallen corpses, fallen unconscious or dead bodies out there, turning corners in a dungeon, getting around trees, anything like that is going to severely hamper you. So then I have a movement based on combat, which is your number of meters or yards in battle is your PP. So if you are, so it'd be three feet times your PP instead of 60 feet times it. That keeps the battle maps working. That keeps people moving, and I completely divorce it from movement, and a lot of people don't necessarily like it because I allow somebody to do their full movement before their first turn, their first action, and then they just kind of have to sit there, or they can move different. But I find that better than having the people only move like 2 squares because they have so many attacks. Um, so I completely divorce it. During this entire melee round, this round, you can move your movement. You can break it down however you want. You can move it all at the beginning, all at the end, in the middle. But once you hit your limit, that's kind of your little exhaustion type thing. You need a moment to take a breath. It works. I know it won't work for everybody. Every game master is going to have to determine how they work speed into a Palladium game, especially when they're trying to use a map, a battle map on a virtual tabletop or on their game table, and not do everything theater of the mind. Um, Physical endurance, again, all the bonuses and everything are the same. The purpose is the same, and that is your hit points. You don't add the d6 to that. The d6 that you get adds to your shock points instead. Uh, so I talked about the exceptional rolls. Here's the attribute chart. It's exactly the same. The only difference is I removed speed because all it said was, again, natural ability to run, the raw natural ability to run. And I went ahead and I combined the PP. I put strike, parry, and dodge bonuses. They always break it up into two, and they're the exact same bonuses across the board. I didn't see a need for one to say dodge and parry. Defense, I understand. Another strike, offense, I understand, but I just didn't see a need to have two things when the bonuses are all the same. Psychic powers, I did differently. Psychic powers, certain species could have psychic abilities and other ones couldn't. I'm going to pause here. I'll be right back. I just got a message and I want to make sure that that's not important. Where's my pause button? Okay, sorry about that. Nothing bad. It's just a message from my mama. And where were we? Oh, psychic powers. So originally, psychic powers, certain species were allowed psychic powers or a chance at, and other ones weren't. And the thing was, it was random. If you were a human or some other species that was allowed, had a chance to get psychic abilities, you rolled percentile, and the biggest roll was no, you didn't get any. And then a slightly higher one was you got minor, which would be just first level abilities, and then you might get major, which was first through third level, and then after that it would be master, which is all one through 10th level psychic abilities, and then each one of those would be a random, so you'd have a 60% chance of getting those. I again decided I didn't want any species to be barred from psychic abilities. um, some of the ones I just didn't understand why they had it and other ones didn't. It wasn't necessarily the cultural things, like dwarves can't be magic because of their bad past experience, and that was a cultural thing more than a species biological thing. So I just was like, anybody can be psychic, especially when I'll just. But I didn't necessarily want it to be random. So I wanted people to decide, but like I kind of did with the Gobble Fairies, based off of the Cobblers, which I took away a D, one of the D6s. If you want to be a minor psychic, you take a D6. You can choose any of the attributes. It doesn't matter. You subtract a D6, and now you get psychic ability all level. You get level one psychic abilities, but I did keep the 60% chance. So I'm not always against chance randomness. It's just I think if somebody has a concept of they want to be a psychic character, a occupation that also has psychic abilities, that is the way to do it. And then master takes away two, and you can separate it. So you could say take one die away from IQ and then another die away from PP, but you have to take two dice away. And then for master, you take three dice away, and that would give you the whole range. So you're limiting your possibilities of your of what you can get, but you are definitely going to get some psychic abilities unless you just roll really bad and you roll a you can't get 60% within, like, say the first, say you choose minor and you subtract a d6 and then you roll every single ability and can't roll a 1 through 60 on all of those. I think that would be extremely hard. I might allow some rerolls or something as a game master, because then you're getting rid of something and not gaining something. But I do like the idea of the 60% per item on whether or not you get it. But psychic powers. Why do I call them psychic powers when they call them psionics? And most games call them psionics. Very simple. Psionics is a portmanteau of psychic and electronics, and I don't like the idea of psionics being in any game that doesn't have some type of electronics. And fantasy worlds usually don't have electronics, so I call them psychic powers instead of psionics. That's very simple reasoning do there. I explained the difference between hit points and shock points and why I separated those. Backgrounds, straight from Palladium. Palladium has a little section when you have a lot of alternate things and they have backgrounds, they get small little bonuses. And basically, I just took exactly that is no different. It's just something that you might not catch because it's not really described anywhere else. Alignment and motive. I've kept all the alignments of Palladium there, but I did add a motive. Motives are something that possibly could change the reasoning or your outcome based off of your alignment. If you are a principled person who normally would never tell a lie, but your motive is, say, protecting the innocent, and you are confronted by a horde that you know that you would not be able to survive a fight with, a horde of orcs or goblins or whatever, just and they are demanding you tell them where some innocents are because they want to kill the innocents. Based off of your alignment, I cannot lie. You might have problems, and especially a game master and player. The player is like, they're going to kill innocents, but your alignment says you can't lie. But this, you have that motive. That motive gives you a reason to break that alignment for a specific reason because of that motive. And it could be something with fame, it could be something with power, it can be, anything out there. But what is the driving force that might change what you do? And it can work in a different way. It can work with, say, an evil character. You have a diabolic character who has a motive of they like animals, and so you got somebody who loves Mars here, and he's absolutely diabolical, but he loves Mars. And a good character comes and rescues a cat from a burning, rescues Mars from a burning building. And that evil, diabolical villain sees that, and maybe that makes him be a little nicer, not so I'm going to kill that paladin there, but maybe he spares the paladin's life because of his motive and he's seen what happens. And it can work good or bad. It can be a temptation. Maybe you have a paladin who wants to be famous, and maybe this little thing, this tiny little bad thing that they do can make them famous. Normally they wouldn't do it, but this gives them the temptation. So it can be for good, it can be for ill. It's just a way to make things not just flat out alignment based. Again, there are books and novels and stuff, and Bandit's Keep had a really interesting thing about alignment and languages. When you would have old D&D had the alignment languages where you knew common and lawful, or common and chaotic, and common and new, and it was, wow, that is just a really weird concept. But if you're talking about a world that is mystically bound and there are these languages that are just known by what alignment you are, it could make sense. So I'm not saying that being bound by alignment is always a bad thing. I'm just saying in my world, I like the idea of it being not just, oh, don't worry about alignment. Like, worry about your alignment. You chose your alignment for a reason, but here are the motives that will make that alignment able to be broken. So that is the alignments and the motives. And then the next thing is occupations, and that will be in the part 2. So I know this has been going on for a very long time, and I will go ahead and stop that here. If you like the video, please hit the like button. If you dislike it, you can hit the dislike button. I guess now YouTube doesn't care and nobody will see it, but you can, as well as if this content, something that is dealing with something not D&D, is interesting to you. If you like Palladium First Edition and trying to figure out how to change things or keep them, but wanting to understand why other people think different ways, or if it's just I have a different game but there's rules out there from other games. How do I bring those in? This might appeal to you. If you like that, think about subscribing. I do thank all 62 of my current subscribers. We've gone up a lot over the last year since I even started the Palladium campaign, so I'm very happy about that. Not everything's Palladium. I talk about other games, Toward Eternity, Earth Dawn. Have been doing a D&D 5th edition. I tend to stay away from D&D. There's much better channels out there to watch that you can get information there as well. But this is kind of just a general role-playing, how I see certain things and thoughts and discussions. So this is part 1 to my Palladium rewrite, the reasoning behind it, the rules that I've changed, why I've done it, and what I've left. So having said that, once again, I'm Zorval Chan, Less Than Guru, Lehman Crafton, and until next time, I will catch you later.